right. Well, welcome to Letters of Intent, the podcast where we explore all things business law, from startups to mergers, from contracts to compliance, and everything in between. I'm Pankaj, Raval, founder of Carbon Law Group. And joining me today is my co-host, Sahil Chaudry, our corporate attorney here at Carbon Law Group. Sahil,
Hey,
welcome again.
Great to be here.
Wonderful. So, Sahil, I see you found a really interesting case to talk about, something in the news that's timely with all that's happening in the world. I'm sure there's a lot to talk about, but one in particular instance is this person named Elon Musk. I feel
That's
like
right.
he's
Little known entrepreneur.
a little known
Musk.
entrepreneur. Yeah, just fledgling, just made his break, right? Yeah, tell us.
That's right.
Yeah, tell us what's going on with Elon Musk and in the world of law.
Okay, perfect. Well, Elon Musk is suing OpenAI, the platform that has changed all of our lives. He's suing OpenAI, Sam Altman, and the president of OpenAI, Greg Brockman, arguing that the company has abandoned its original nonprofit mission and transformed into a profit-driven enterprise controlled by Microsoft. So this lawsuit raises some really interesting corporate law questions, including contract breaches and fiduciary duties in nonprofit governance, the legality of nonprofit transitioning into a for-profit entity, and there are also antitrust concerns related to Microsoft's influence over OpenAI. And for our clients, there are some implications here because oftentimes a client of ours will want to start a nonprofit, and it may or may not be the best option given the goal and the purpose. In this case, kind of breaks down different ways of thinking about what is the mission of the entity, and does that line up with the actual execution of the organization?
Yeah, really, really interesting. I think this seems like a case where the parties had the best intents. They had the best intentions of creating a company that is going to be ethical and have this kind of nonprofit mission. But as we can see, it made actually things maybe more complicated for them in the long run.
That's true. So when OpenAI was founded in 2015, it was funded by donations because it was a nonprofit, and they were able to receive donations in an amount that equaled around $1 billion.
Wow.
So that is kind of, from an outsider's perspective, it looks like any other corporation, but in fact, it was founded as a nonprofit organization with the mission of developing AI, and specifically in their charter, it's for the benefit of humanity.
Wow.
Elon Musk was one of the key early funders, invested millions into the company, but in 2018, Musk left OpenAI after a dispute over control. In 2019, OpenAI transitioned from a nonprofit to a for-profit model, and this is called specifically a capped profit model. That allowed them to raise billions of dollars in funding, and the biggest investor was Microsoft, which has poured $10 billion into OpenAI. So what's the cap profit model? It's basically a nonprofit that owns a for-profit entity.
Interesting.
Now, that for-profit entity does have certain rules, and that for-profit entity has restrictions around the money that's earned, but it does allow you to share money with shareholders in the for-profit entity as long as the primary beneficiary of that entity is the nonprofit, ultimately.
Interesting.
So we fast forward to February 2024, and Musk files a lawsuit in California state court claiming that, 1, OpenAI has abandoned its nonprofit mission. 2, OpenAI is now profit-driven and controlled by Microsoft. And 3, the transition to a for-profit entity violated OpenAI's original charter.
Fascinating. So what does this mean? Like, what is Musk's goal here?
It's a good question. I mean, some people think it's related to his concerns about Microsoft, and in fact, Musk has raised antitrust concerns here under the Clayton Act. So essentially, society has, and as a result, the government has passed laws to prevent monopolies from being developed in order to encourage price competition, make sure that consumers are protected. So what Musk is alleging here is basically this is a de facto merger with Microsoft. Even though OpenAI is saying, no, it's not, Musk is saying, look, Microsoft is basically exerting an inordinate amount of control over OpenAI. And so this is basically a merger. They're cornering the market. And there are concerns from Musk's side that his own AI projects might get sidelined as a result. So there could be an altruistic humanitarian reason here, but there also could be a personal profit reason here, which is that he might be getting marginalized in this race to conquer AI.
Yeah.
And from a guy, ripping a chainsaw on stage at CPAC, I don't know how altruistic it is. We don't know.
Right. No, this is interesting. Yeah, because we're seeing what he's doing in the public. I recently tried out his AI Grok 3. They had a new release, and it absolutely smells like he is concerned with his own business interests as well with filing this lawsuit. So it's interesting now he's like resorting to litigation, which is not new for him. When you have $400 billion, it's easy to file lawsuits left and right. But potentially try to slow this down, but it doesn't sound like he's going to be able to slow things down too much. What are the other issues in this case?
So to go through the legal process here, the case was originally filed in California State Court, but later moved to the federal court in the U.S. District Court for the Northern District of California on March 4th, 2025. That's just 2 days ago. Judge Rogers denied Musk's request for a preliminary injunction. So this is a big deal because essentially OpenAI wants to be able to operate in this capped profit model, and Musk wants to prevent them from being able to do that. And he's been denied his preliminary injunction, which means on the facts alone, there is not a case to be made where it's an automatic injunction that this should be prevented. There's some kind of irreparable harm that could come from not preventing this. So that's a loss for Musk.
What does an injunction do? Just for listeners who may not be familiar, what does that mean if someone's trying to get an injunction?
So there are two basic types of remedies in a court of law. One is financial, money damages. In a civil court, money, or the alternative remedy is a remedy of equity, which is an injunction, which means physically we are halting you from doing something because we're worried that you continuing to do this, there's a too high of a risk that if you're doing something that is in fact unlawful, we don't want to let the repercussions of that. The risk of what you're doing is in fact very high, and the risk that it is unlawful is very high. And so we have a right to stop you from doing it until we figure out if it's lawful or not.
Right.
Yeah, a preliminary injunction allows you, before there's a verdict, to stop someone from doing what they're doing.
It's a pretty aggressive approach, right? I mean, I think usually people file a lawsuit, it goes into discovery, but injunction essentially tries to quickly stop someone from doing something.
That's right. Yeah.
Right. Okay. Interesting.
Yeah. In fact, it stops someone from doing something. It is a very aggressive approach because you're not even letting the matter be litigated. You're asking for the judge to intervene and block them from doing what they're doing, which in this case, if we look at the scales here, there's quite a big interest. Society's interest in OpenAI is actually quite high. Where OpenAI functioning, it's kicked open the doors for the public to be able to use this service. And so it probably was a very high burden to meet in order to compel an injunction.
So Musk is trying to block OpenAI's for-profit transition immediately. What does that mean?
Musk was seeking a preliminary injunction to halt OpenAI's partnership with Microsoft and prevent further commercialization of its AI models while the case was pending. But the judge ruled that Musk didn't provide enough evidence to justify immediate intervention. However, she did allow some key claims to proceed to trial, recognizing that this case raises significant public interest issues.
So it is going to trial, but he failed to obtain that preliminary injunction.
Exactly. So that doesn't mean that OpenAI is out of the woods yet. It means that it could be that, because on one hand, Musk is arguing something that is in the public interest, which is should OpenAI remain a nonprofit entity or should it have a for-profit component? And the judge probably does have to weigh those factors. The judge has to weigh, is there a public interest in ensuring that OpenAI remains a nonprofit completely, or is there some benefit to the profit incentive? And ultimately, the judge will probably have to investigate the Clayton Act claims, the antitrust claims, as well as whether taking this action breaches the original charter of the nonprofit.
It is fascinating because, yeah, you have more restrictions as a nonprofit. This kind of reminds listeners, hopefully, that the type of entity you choose does really matter in terms of what you can do. And, especially depending on where you set it up, there's benefit corporations, especially as you get larger, you have a lot more stakeholders, and now you have to be answering to a lot more people, and your charter and, what your founding documents really say really do matter, which is really interesting. So this doesn't seem like the only issue raised by Musk in this case. Tell us what else came up in this case. What else is Musk alleging?
Yeah, so Musk is basically alleging that Microsoft $10 billion has effectively turned OpenAI into a subsidiary of Microsoft, which could violate antitrust laws. So specifically, you have the Clayton Act, Section 8, prohibits interlocking directorates where one company exerts too much influence over another in an anti-competitive way. So essentially, if OpenAI and Microsoft are teamed up, could they squash all the other competition to the point where there are no other real competitors?
Right.
That could be a bad situation for consumers who then only have one option, and there's a risk of price gouging. There are all kinds of reasons for the Clayton Act to be in existence, but that's an issue that Musk is bringing up. Musk is also alleging that there's a de facto merger here. Microsoft's influence over OpenAI is so strong that it should legally be considered a merger, which would require antitrust review. That is a big issue. And then the issue that I think relates to our own clients as well is the issue of, does this breach the founding charter of the nonprofit? And that's where, a lot of our clients might download a template for incorporation documents, but what you write in that charter actually does matter, especially if it's a nonprofit. If it's a nonprofit, you're scrutinized much more heavily by the state government, and you can't just engage in any kind of transaction you want. There are some very strict rules. And this is a very good example here. It begs the question. I mean, I wasn't in the boardroom when Sam Altman was deciding to launch OpenAI, but it does beg the question, like, why choose a nonprofit in this case? And right. I wonder if in your experience with clients, if you've seen something that could go either way, it could be a for-profit or a nonprofit. Why would someone choose a nonprofit?
Yeah, this is interesting. I listened to an interview of Sam Altman actually shortly after they tried to kick him out. They did remove him. They fired him, and then they brought him back. It was a very tumultuous time at OpenAI, which kind of raised a lot of, sounded the alarm, I think, to a lot of people saying, oh, what exactly is happening here? What have they figured out that's causing all this internal strife? There's raised a lot of questions. And I think, based on what he was saying, it sounded like they really had this goal to set up an ethically based AI company because they understood the reality of the risks of creating an AI company and, obtaining AGI, and what would that mean for the world, and the risks of developing AI and wanting to do it ethically. So they wanted to create a nonprofit foundation, that would fund that, and hopefully, I think, share those findings with the world. However, it looks like Microsoft's involvement, the involvement of so many other so much private money, has probably muddied that. And now there's a lot of, people seeing the dollar signs, and now they're saying, oh, well, maybe it's better to be, commercially viable as opposed to being a nonprofit. Is just my conjecture. I would actually, have to read a little bit more about this. And I don't know if anyone knows the truth, but it seems like that was the intention originally.
Just in conversations with our clients, I do feel this does bring us to a broader question, which is if someone is thinking about starting an organization, should they go for a nonprofit or a for profit? And I would say that if you're going to start a nonprofit, it sounds like because, especially, it's a charitable organization, there isn't the objective of profit making. So sometimes our clients might think it's an easy thing to do, but it actually comes with a lot of regulation. So if you genuinely want to prioritize a public benefit and accept tax exempt donations, and you are comfortable with having very strict regulations regarding being board controlled, then we can go with a nonprofit. And also, if you are comfortable with raising money in the form of donations, but not in the form of shares, if you have people are expecting some kind of return on their investment, a nonprofit model is definitely not the way to go. I think people hear that nonprofits are tax exempt and try to think of, okay, how can we come up with a way where we can use this model for a for profit purpose? But it's far too difficult and far too regulated, I think, from our perspective, to let those lines get blurry. If you're going for a nonprofit, it strictly needs to be for the purpose of a charitable purpose, a public benefit, and you have to know that you don't own that corporation. That corporation is actually it doesn't have shares. It's actually governed by the state, and in fact, you're really operating that organization as a trustee
Right.
on behalf of the state in a way.
That's a great point. That's a great point. That's a great point. Yeah, there's a lot of nuances with starting a nonprofit. I think we could probably do a whole podcast on that
Right.
subject itself because people don't realize the complexity in terms of they have the ownership of the assets. If you dissolve or liquidate, where do the assets go? The assets have to go to another nonprofit. So these are all really interesting issues that come up, and also just compliance. When you create a nonprofit, people don't realize a lot of people don't recognize that you file a state formation document, whatever state it might be in, but then you apply to the IRS under Rule 501, whatever. There's a variety of different exemptions that you can apply for, but I think it's 501. Yeah, 501c3 is the public nonprofit, but there's private foundations, there's political action, there's religious foundations. So it all really depends on what you're doing. But also the IRS is going to check because this is oftentimes abused by so many different organizations. You have these mega churches, making billions and millions of dollars, right, and they're tax free. So the IRS is definitely going to look at what you're doing and ensure that you do actually have a public purpose. And there's so much fraud every year that is found by people using nonprofits to avoid taxes, and definitely people got to know that is a reality they're going to have to address if they're trying to use a nonprofit for some nefarious or incorrect purpose.
So it does mean that the time you spend deciding what kind of entity you're starting with is time well spent. We can see in this case that this is now the difference between being a nonprofit and for profit and transitioning to a hybrid capped profit model is now causing OpenAI to go through litigation that's going to be very expensive. They're going through this conflict. It's really important to know at the beginning of your journey, knowing that things can change, but it's really important at the beginning of your journey to know what's your goal. And the more you think about your goal, the more prepared you are to file the right kind of entity. And that entity can then carry you into your objectives.
Talking about this case, there was other claims brought by Musk about breach of contract. I'm not
Yes.
sure if we got into those, but yeah, maybe you can explain to us what those are about.
Yeah. So essentially, Musk is arguing that OpenAI's founders, including Sam Altman and Greg Brockman, agreed to keep OpenAI nonprofit. And by transitioning to a for profit model, they broke that agreement. Additionally, he claims that OpenAI's leaders had a fiduciary duty to act in the best interests of the nonprofit mission, but instead, they prioritized profit and investor interests, particularly Microsoft's. In this case, we're saying when you form an entity, that operating agreement, those articles of incorporation, those bylaws, those are a contract, and they're an important document that ensures your company or your nonprofit is executing the objectives that it set out to execute on. And it becomes really important in a nonprofit because there is a public benefit component there. So Musk is arguing that, look, this whole thing was started specifically to help humanity, to use to make AI accessible to people. And now by adding this for-profit entity, even though legally you can use a capped profit approach where your nonprofit owns a for-profit, that's possible. That's legally possible. Except Musk is claiming to do that runs completely counter to the original charter. So if it didn't run counter to the original charter, there could be room, and there still might be, depending on how Judge Rogers rules. But as of right now, Musk is arguing you're breaching contract and you're also breaching your fiduciary duty. So fiduciary duties are implied duties that someone responsible for an organization has. So, for example, a fiduciary duty is to act reasonably. A fiduciary duty is to protect the interests of your stakeholders. In this case, that could be the directors. In this case, that could also be the public interest that is being served. In a for profit corporation, you have fiduciary duties to your shareholders specifically. But in this case, there are no shareholders. So you've got fiduciary duties to public interest that you're serving. So that could be a really interesting argument that Musk could make.
This fiduciary duty is breach is a really interesting one. I think it comes up a lot in multi-member entities, whether it be LLCs or corporations, and it's that duty of loyalty, the duty of good faith that that can often be alleged that someone's breaching due to the self-dealing or whatever it might be. So definitely an interesting issue, but it also brings up a kind of a broader legal question. In this case, can a nonprofit even transition into a for-profit legal entity? I mean, is that even possible?
Yes, the answer is yes, but it's complicated. When a nonprofit shifts to a for-profit model, it must comply with strict legal guidelines. There are asset transfer rules. Nonprofits cannot simply convert to a for-profit. They must sell their assets at a fair market value to ensure no private individual benefits unfairly. And also, when they're selling substantially all their assets, those assets must go to another nonprofit. There are board and donor obligations. If the nonprofit received tax-exempt donations, the board must prove that its new structure still aligns with its original mission. See, for example, if I've accepted donations as a nonprofit, somebody gave me that money for a specific purpose. If that money now is being, or the assets that I purchased with that money are now being used for another purpose, that violates the spirit of where the donation came from in the first place.
Makes sense.
So it's not like in a for-profit entity where if I buy computers and those computers are used to store the inventory of chocolates I'm selling, it doesn't matter if I'm selling chocolates or shirts or shovels. It's essentially, as long as I'm in a profit-making enterprise, most likely that could align with my charter, my LLC agreement, or my articles of incorporation, my bylaws. However, if I'm a nonprofit and I'm specifically focused on something like AI, even if it's a charitable purpose, if it doesn't align with the mission for which the donation was given, that could be a problem. In OpenAI's case, it's transitioning to a cap profit model where the for-profit arm, OpenAI LP, is still governed by the nonprofit entity and, in fact, is owned by the nonprofit entity. But Musk is arguing that this is just a loophole that allows them to act like a private company. And in a way, it is.
That is fascinating. Yeah, I feel like there's. I don't think like Musk is off base. I mean, what do you think about Musk's argument?
It seems like Musk does have an argument here. If we break down the legal arguments, let's start with the Clayton Act and antitrust. Yeah, I think there's an argument here because Microsoft and OpenAI could certainly corner the market. There aren't that many players with those kinds of resources. Do I think there might be a selfish profit interest here from Musk's side where he feels like he's getting sidelined out of the AI game? I think, yes, that is a possibility. But is there a legal argument? Yes, there is a legal argument here. And then the second issue, if we deal with the charter is specifically aimed at engaging with AI and promoting AI for the benefit of humanity. So if there is a for profit arm that is now able to raise money and profit all off of the work that the nonprofit has been doing, yes, that does seem like it could subvert the purpose of the charter in the first place. And finally, the question of fiduciary duty. The question becomes, does launching this for profit entity serve the fiduciaries of OpenAI? Now, the question becomes, who is the fiduciary? And in a nonprofit, the fiduciary is the people that that nonprofit is serving, the beneficiaries. So if the public benefits more, since that's what the purpose of the charter is saying the purpose of this entity is to empower humanity with the tools of AI. If this for profit entity does not serve that purpose, there certainly is an argument that this is violating the fiduciary duties the directors have.
This also kind of raises a question now that, if we're seeing OpenAI start a nonprofit instead of for profit, is it better to start a nonprofit than a for profit in today's world?
It's a good question. I think if you genuinely have a nonprofit purpose, I think the issue is here. OpenAI launched with a nonprofit purpose, but did they? The question is, was it maybe more financially lucrative or interesting to start a nonprofit and collect donations from all of these business interests? I mean,
Right.
the business interests initially that were funding, I mean, Elon Musk donated millions of dollars. So you actually did have these very large business players who are donating this money. But now the question is, was that really more of a financial play? And was the end game going to be, well, once, these are all this is tax exempt money. Let's use this to create a commercially viable product, and then we'll capitalize on that.
Yeah.
And maybe Musk and the other players who were in on this from the beginning knew that that was the roadmap. But when that roadmap started to threaten their own interests, they want to, throw a wrench in this machine that's now going in a for-profit direction.
Yeah.
Or Musk is genuinely concerned about empowering humanity with AI and is concerned that now, even though initially it was a nonprofit purpose, give it some time and people start seeing dollar signs, and now the purpose is subverted because there's just too much money to ignore.
Right.
And people can make too much off of this. And maybe initially the players involved didn't realize they could make that much, but I doubt it. I mean, we're playing with some very intelligent, powerful people here.
I mean, it's interesting. It's there's a I think a greed element to this. A personal interest element to this that people have to kind of consider as well. In terms of the motivations. Let's say you're not sure between a nonprofit and for profit. You want to benefit. You want to do something that's benefiting humanity. You feel like you have some kind of altruistic mission, but also maybe you don't want to be tied down by some of the restrictions of a nonprofit. Is there a middle ground?
Yes, there is a middle ground. The middle ground would actually be the example we're talking about here, which is the cap profit model, which is where you have a nonprofit. You don't own the nonprofit, but the nonprofit owns for-profit entities. And those for-profit entities can earn money as long as they're supporting the nonprofit. So you can still have shareholders who benefit in that subsidiary, but the primary beneficiary needs to be the nonprofit. So there is a middle ground.
Interesting.
I would say that if you are identifying the model that if you're unsure, it's better to err on the side of a for-profit entity because you can earn profit through that entity. And then you could always donate the money. If you have a charitable cause, you could donate that money and benefit from a tax exempt donation without being subject to the rules around nonprofits.
There's definitely a lot to talk about. I think definitely in a future episode we'll be going a little bit deeper into nonprofits and what that means in today's world as well, because changing regulations. But this has been a fascinating conversation. I think to sum it up, it sounds like Musk's lawsuit raises kind of critical legal questions about nonprofit governance, corporate ethics, and even antitrust laws. What else do you feel is your main takeaway from this lawsuit that Musk filed and even our conversation today?
I think it also highlights the complexities of nonprofit transitions and why founders need strong legal guidance when structuring their organizations.
Yeah.
I think people can easily take for granted the legal structuring that's required for you to do what you want to do. If you've discovered a product or you have a charitable cause, there's something that you really want to do, but we're in a regulated environment. And so having legal counsel that walks you through each step of the way before you are able to run and trip, it's better to just have us there to walk you through those transactions to ensure that a legal issue is not going to be the thing that holds you back from achieving your goals. Yeah, it highlights the complexities of nonprofit transitions and why founders need strong legal guidance when structuring their organizations. The decision of whether you're a C corp or whether you're an S corp or an LLC or a nonprofit or a cap profit model in this case, it's not such a simple decision. And it's important to have legal counsel guide you through each step of the way. Even when it's time to change, there might be a situation where there's a dynamic situation, there's a new transaction, there's a new idea. There is a way to do it, but we're in a highly regulated environment. And so you need to make sure you're compliant so that you don't trip over yourself in the process of doing what you love.
It is fascinating. I think the irony is that also Mr. Musk is now bringing a chainsaw to the federal government, trying to eliminate all the regulations that he's now suing over too. So it is an interesting kind of pot calling the kettle black situation here, where he's doing he's complaining about regulations and complaining about people not following rules on one side, but he is now also actively engaged in dismantling the regulations that govern a lot of business and other aspects of our political life. So,
That's right.
So Sahil, thank you so much for your astute breakdown of this case. I think it was extremely fascinating, and I learned a lot from the information presented today. That is the episode for Letters of Intent today. We have many more coming. And if you guys want to hear about anything specific or have questions, please leave us a message, DM us, email us. Easy to get a hold of us at carbonlawgroup.com or carbonlg.com, and as well as on social media. Sahil also is on social media. I'm on social media through LinkedIn. So we'd love to hear back from you. We want to know if this is a valuable insight, and we hope to hear from you again or see you again on future episodes.
Love it.